Okay, what we've just looked at are a couple of videos there showing you the first classification systems of organisms, so grouping organisms based upon similar characteristics. And the main person that we focus on when it comes to this classification system is Linnaeus. So what you were walked through the classification of a lion. And if you notice my triangle here, my pyramid, I have it upside down. So a little bit different when we looked at the levels of organization when we went from smallest to largest. In this case, we're going to go from largest to smallest. So when we're talking about this classification of the lion, the first grouping or the first classification level, which is called a taxon, is the domain. And the domain of a lion is eukarya. They're eukaryotes because they have a nucleus. Next comes the kingdom. So there are 6 kingdoms. Lions are in the kingdom Animalia. Then after kingdom is the phylum. Lions are in the phylum Chordata. They are called chordates. So that means they have a dorsal nerve cord. After phylum, we have the class. So they're class Mammalia. And then order. And this is where we separate from the lion. So in the video, they ask you, like, where do we separate? This is where we separate. So up until that point, we were in the same domain. So we have a nucleus, we're eukaryotes. We're animals. We have that spine, that vertebrate, our nerve cord, and we have 4 limbs and have fur, hair, and give birth to live young. So this is where we separate from the lion. But let's finish up with the lion. After carnivora, then we go to class Felidae, so typically we refer to that as the cat family. And then the last 2 levels are the genus and then the species. And you notice they're written a little different. So the genus and the species, the last 2 classification categories, this is where you also will get your scientific name. So a lion is a common name for an organism. Panthera leo is the scientific name. So identifying the genus of organisms. So Panthera was described in the video as a genus of organisms of large cats that roar and will probably tear your face off. And then if we're talking about the lion, we would have Leo as being the species name or the species descriptor. So our first topic is going to be classifying organisms. How do you classify organisms? So this is a branch of biology referred to as taxonomy. So naming of organisms also falls into this category because of those last 2 categories, genus and species, where we get our scientific name. So not only is it grouping organisms based upon similar characteristics, but it's also about coming up with a scientific name that is universally accepted. So with this one, we're looking at the American black bear, which is native to Virginia, the Ursus americanus. And if we go through this one really quickly, we have the eukaryotes here, so anything that has the nucleus is in the domain. And then for the kingdom, we're going to get rid of some of the other kingdoms. So we're in kingdom Animalia, so our black bear, and then the other animals. So we get rid of, down here, we get rid of protists, um, and we're going to get rid of plants, and we're going to get rid of fungus. They're gone. Now, the reason that bacteria are not in here is because they're not eukaryotes, they're prokaryotes, so they're not going to be in here to begin with. And then as we move down, each of the levels get smaller and smaller, so they get more exclusive. So we kick out those that don't match. So when we're talking about chordates, we're talking about having that dorsal nerve cord, phylum of chordates. So there goes the sponges and the butterflies, they're gone. Moving down to the mammals, so giving birth to the live young. So goodbye, fish. Oh, there go our frogs. Then carnivora. So carnivora, we can think about having a diet of mostly meat, big teeth to tear flesh. So we just chopped out the zebras. Ursidae, so we've got our bears. And then going down to our genus, Ursus. So we just kicked out the panda bears. Goodbye. And then the species is Americanus. Now, the Americanus here is a species descriptor. So a lot of times the species name, the species descriptor, is descriptive of some aspect of the organism. In this case, it would be geography. So as you look at this, as we go from the domain down to the species, each of these groupings here, which are called taxon, if you're talking singular, taxa, if you're referring to the, more than one, they go from being very broad categories down to very specific. In fact, the most specific is the species. And a species is a grouping of organisms that are so closely related to each other that they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. This is something that we saw in ecology. The species, when we're talking about species, we're talking about population. So we're talking about the most related group of organisms. Now here's a little memory device that a lot of people use to remember um, the classification groups in order. And it is Dear King Philip came over for good soup. It's actually supposed to be spaghetti, but I couldn't get it to fit neatly in here. But you could say Dear King Philip came over for good spaghetti. All right. So here is one final example before we start talking a little bit more about the scientific name. So if you look, we are going to classify this wolf. So here we'll start out with the kingdom. Now, a lot of places, including our very own textbook, tend to just kind of skip right over the domain. But when you're talking about the domain, there's two basic things. Does it have a nucleus? Does it not have a nucleus? Is it a eukaryote? Is it a prokaryote? That's the two basic ways to get this whole process started. And then we start looking at other characteristics. So if we're talking about the animals, um, we're talking about our main group here of consumers. So every animal is a consumer, which would distinguish them from, let's say, the plant kingdom, where we're talking about producers. So then we'll move down to the chordates. So again, chordate, I've explained it before. Those are your vertebrates having that spine. So we just got rid of that icky spider, thank goodness. And then moving down to the mammals, so giving birth to live, young, and then carnivora, Canidae, so the dog family, canines, genus Canis, and then finally the species is Lupus. So when I think about this, the scientific name of the wolf is Canis lupus. That's its scientific name. And if you look at it, it's written a little differently. Usually it's in italics. It's that kind of slanted print, and the genus is capitalized, the species is lowercase. But when I think about Canis lupus, I think that J.K. Rowling knew a little bit either of her Latin or maybe a little bit of science or maybe a little bit of both. Um, if you think back and if you know what Professor Lupin was. Hmm. Okay, now to the part of taxonomy where we get those universally accepted names. So this is a mouthful here, but you can see how it's broken down. Binomial nomenclature. So every organism that has been identified, classified, is known by a scientific name, and usually the scientific name has some type of Latin feel to it, like um, Ursus americanus. Yeah, that we don't talk like that. Um, but the genus and the species is where you get the scientific name. So you don't have to classify an organism and then come up with a name. You just use the last two classification categories as the name. The genus comes first, as it does in the classification. It is capitalized and the species is second and it's lowercase. If you are writing these, handwriting these, usually you're expected to underline them to say, hey, this is a special name. And if you're typing them, you're supposed to put them in italics. So this two-name naming process is binomial nomenclature. So to look at a couple other little examples here, well, a couple of things that I noticed when I look at this one, I see the house sparrow and the English sparrow has the same scientific name, so that means that they're going to be reproductively viable. That means that they can interbreed. And their name is Passer domesticus. So again, I'm going to look at this species, and I think domesticus is a word that I already know, already have an understanding of, and it's describing our birds. So when you think about domesticus, you might remember what a cat is, Felis domesticus, dog, Canis familiaris. So thinking about those, what does that make you think then about a house sparrow or an English sparrow? And now just one more little thing I want to throw in here is about this species descriptor. Now, you may read an article about a grouping of plants, a group of bacteria, or a genus of some type of organism, and you might just see the genus. When I think of this, I think about Clostridium tetani and Clostridium botulinum. Both of them have the same first name, so they're in the same genus. So I could be talking about this group of bacteria that can make people pretty sick, tetanus, botulism, and I could just say bacteria from the genus Clostridium. But what I wouldn't want to do is just put tetani or botulinum by itself, because that second name might be tied to another genus. And to show you the example here, um, first the descriptor here, alba. So alba is referring to white. So if I just put alba by itself, I don't know what that could be. It could be this barn owl here. So you can see it's named Tyto alba. See its white face. Or this Quercus alba, I could be talking about a white oak. So you won't see, or you shouldn't see, the species written by itself, but there is a possibility that you could see the genus written by itself. All right, so I've got a little bit for you to kind of play around with classification, the classification system. So look over that and see what you can do with it, and then come on back to the slides.